My son asked me to dress simple. Not casual. Not comfortable. Simple. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. The pause before he spoke told me someone else had already decided how I should be seen. I agreed. That night, I walked into a restaurant where conversations lowered the moment I arrived. Where eyes traveled before smiles did. No one was rude. That would have been easier. Instead, they were polite in a way that keeps score. My son wouldn't meet my eyes. His wife sat perfectly still, like she was waiting for instructions she didn't want to hear. And across the table, her parents watched me carefully, not understanding me, but to place me. I ordered what was suggested. I spoke only when spoken to. I let them believe exactly what they wanted, because the truth wasn't something I planned to announce. It was something they were about to discover, quietly, all at once, when it was far too late to pretend nothing had changed. The restaurant was the kind of place where the menus didn't have prices. That detail mattered more than the chandeliers, more than the host who greeted us by name, more than the quiet confidence of the waitstaff who moved like they'd been trained not to hurry for anyone. A place without prices wasn't built for choice. It was built for assumption. For the kind of people who didn't ask what something cost because the answer had never mattered. The lighting was warm but selective, designed to flatter certain faces and leave others unnoticed. Tables were spaced far enough apart that conversations could pretend to be private while still being observed. Even the air felt curated, filtered, controlled, expensive. David was already there when I arrived. My son sat straighter the moment he saw me. Not with pride, with relief. It was subtle, the way his shoulders dropped, the way his breath finally found a rhythm again. I'd seen it before. When he was 10 and waiting outside the principal's office. When he was 16 and afraid to tell me he'd failed his first math test. When he needed someone else in the room, so the pressure didn't rest entirely on him. He smiled, stood halfway, then sat again, caught between manners and uncertainty. I looked harmless. I looked small. The gray cardigan hung loosely on me, the sleeves pushed up just enough to show wrists that didn't wear a watch anymore. No jewelry beyond a thin chain at my throat. My hair pulled back without ceremony. Nothing about me demanded attention. And I knew, before anyone spoke, that was exactly the role they needed me to play. The host pulled out my chair last. Not rudely, just efficiently, as if my presence was an afterthought already accounted for. Then the Richardsons arrived. Richard first. He filled space without effort, the way men do when they've been rewarded for volume their entire lives. His laugh preceded him by a half second, loud enough to announce confidence, practiced enough to sound natural. His suit fit perfectly in a way that suggested it had never known a rack. Susan followed, her posture flawless, movements precise. Her jewelry was minimal but unmistakable, pieces chosen not to dazzle, but to signal. The kind of elegance that tells you she knows exactly who is watching and why. They didn't look at the table right away. They looked at the room. Then they saw me. Susan's eyes traveled down my cardigan, paused at the buttons, lingered for just a fraction too long at the hem. Not curiosity. Assessment. She lifted her gaze back to my face and smiled. It was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, David," she said, voice light, musical, performative. "Your mother looks so comfortable." She let the word land. Comfortable. It was an insult wrapped in a bow, padded with politeness so no one could accuse her of cruelty. The kind of comment that sounded generous to anyone not standing directly beneath it. David laughed too quickly. A reflex. The laugh of a man trying to smooth a moment before it cut him. He didn't look at me. Richard nodded once, approvingly, like a judge confirming a suspicion. "Long drive?" he asked me, not waiting for the answer. "We should order," Susan said, already reaching for the menu. We sat. The chairs were low and firm, designed to keep you present, aware of your body, your posture, your place. A waiter appeared immediately, poured water without asking. Sparkling for them. Still for me. No one asked if that was my preference. The conversation began without me. For the next hour, they talked around me. Not at me. Not with me. Around me, like I was a piece of furniture everyone agreed not to trip over. They talked about the Hamptons first. About weather patterns and property taxes, and how the new neighbors weren't quite the right fit. Susan spoke with the authority of someone who believed geography itself should be curated. Richard interrupted freely, correcting details that didn't need correcting, adding numbers where none were required. Then the market. Richard leaned back, swirling his wine like it was an extension of his hand. He spoke in absolutes about timing, about leverage, about risk. Every sentence carried the unspoken implication that survival belonged to the bold and the rest deserved whatever happened to them. "These days," he said, tapping the rim of his glass, "you can't afford to be sentimental. Vision matters. Toughness matters. You have to be willing to step over people who slow you down." Susan nodded, lips pursed in agreement. "Compassion is lovely," she said, "but it doesn't build anything." David nodded too. Not enthusiastically. Carefully, like a man afraid to disagree, but equally afraid to agree too much. Richard leaned toward him then, lowering his voice into something meant to sound instructional rather than cruel. "You need to be aggressive, David," he said. "In this world, there are wolves and there are sheep." He paused, not because he needed to think, because he wanted the moment to stretch. Then his eyes flicked toward me. Brief, casual, surgical. "You don't want to be a sheep," he continued. "Like some people." The words settled between us like a stain. David stared at his plate. Not at me. Not at Richard. At the plate. That hurt more than the insult. Because insults reveal character. Silence reveals loyalty. I noticed then how David held his fork too tightly, how his jaw clenched once and released. He was fighting a battle he didn't know how to name. The kind of battle sons fight when they realize the room expects them to choose sides without ever saying so aloud. Susan sensed the tension and moved to smooth it, not to heal it, but to control it. She leaned forward, elbows just off the table, voice lowering into something that pretended to be kind. Performative concern. Practice sympathy. "We know things might be tight for you," she said to me. "Raising a child on your own all those years. It can't have been easy." She waited a beat, then smiled again. "Richard and I were thinking, maybe we could set up a small monthly stipend for you. Just for groceries. So you don't have to worry." She said it softly, but loud enough for the waiter to hear. Loud enough for the table beside us to glance over. Loud enough to turn generosity into spectacle. They weren't offering help. They were buying their own superiority. I felt David's body tense beside me. His foot shifted under the table, then stilled. He still didn't look at me. I wondered, briefly, whether he was ashamed of them, or of me, or of himself for not knowing what to do. The waiter set down my plate. Chicken. Exactly as suggested earlier. Arranged neatly, modestly, apologetically. I picked up my knife. Cut carefully. Chewed slowly. I could feel Susan watching me, measuring my reaction. Waiting for gratitude. Or embarrassment. Or relief. "That's very generous," I said softly. "But I manage." The words were calm. Neutral. Unemotional. Richard laughed. Short. Sharp. The laugh of a man who believed he had just been challenged. "Pride is expensive, my dear," he said. "You should learn to take what the winners offer." He said winners like it was a credential. Like it was inherited. Susan tilted her head, studying me now with open curiosity, as if I'd failed a test she assumed was simple. David swallowed. I saw his throat move. Still, he said nothing. I nodded. Not in agreement. In acknowledgement. And stayed quiet. Because people like them don't listen when you speak. They listen when the room does. And the room was still on their side. For now. The dessert menus had just arrived when the noise in the restaurant died. It wasn't gradual. It wasn't courteous. It didn't ripple outward the way polite silences do. It was instant. Like someone had cut the power. Conversations snapped shut midword. Forks hovered, then froze. Even the low hum of music from the bar seemed to lose its confidence, thinning into something uncertain. It was the kind of silence that doesn't ask permission. The kind that arrives because everyone feels the same thing at once and doesn't know why. Richard stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence. Not at the end. Not after a thought. In the middle. His eyes locked onto something behind me, widening just slightly before draining of color. The bravado left his face so quickly it was almost educational. The man who had filled the room with certainty moments ago now looked small, as if the air had been let out of him. "My God," he whispered. "Not for us. Not for attention. To himself. That's General Vance." I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I knew the sound of the footsteps. Heavy. Measured. Unmistakable. Military grade. I'd heard them in briefing rooms, in hallways where decisions didn't echo because they didn't need to. Footsteps that didn't hurry and didn't hesitate because the world usually moved out of their way. General Vance. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. The man Richard had been chasing for 3 years. 3 years of calls unanswered, emails routed through assistants, introductions that never quite materialized. The man who existed in Richard's world as an unreachable prize. Richard scrambled to his feet. The chair scraped loudly against the floor, the sound too sharp for the room. He fumbled with his jacket, missing the first button, then correcting himself with shaking hands. His posture shifted, shoulders back, chin lifted. Every instinct reaching for authority that had evaporated seconds earlier. "General," he called out. His voice cracked on the word. Richard cleared his throat, the sound small and uncertain. I wish we'd known," he said. "We would've." "Would've what?" I asked gently. The question hung between us. Susan finally looked up. Her eyes met mine for the first time all evening, not assessing now, not measuring. Just exposed. She opened her mouth, then stopped, as if every possible sentence had suddenly revealed itself to be dangerous. I stood. The movement drew every eye back to me. Chairs shifted. Someone at the next table leaned back instinctively, as though space were required. "The stipend won't be necessary," I said. Susan flinched. I adjusted my cardigan, not to hide myself, but out of habit. The same habit that had kept me steady in rooms far less forgiving than this one. "But thank you for dinner," I continued. "It was educational." Richard nodded too quickly. Susan said nothing. David stood as well, a second too late, then froze, unsure whether to follow me or stay where he was. I placed my napkin neatly on the table. The velvet box remained untouched. "I'll call you tomorrow," I said to David. He nodded. Hard. His eyes never left my face. Then I turned and walked away. No applause followed. No murmurs. Just the soft sound of cutlery being set down, of people remembering how to breathe again. Outside, the night air was cool and clean. The kind that clears your head whether you want it to or not. I stood there for a moment, letting the noise of the city replace the weight I'd left behind. I didn't feel powerful. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt finished. And as I walked toward my car, I understood something I'd learned long ago, but had almost forgotten. True power doesn't shout. It doesn't explain itself. It doesn't correct people when they misunderstand you. It waits. And when it finally speaks, it doesn't need to raise its voice. It simply leaves. Outside, the night was cool. Not cold, just clean. The kind of air that feels like a reset after being indoors too long. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting it settle against my skin, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the muted laughter drifting from somewhere down the block. Life continued, indifferent to whatever lessons had just been learned inside that restaurant. I felt like myself again. Not the version of me shaped by other people's expectations. Not the woman reduced to a silhouette in someone else's story. Just myself, steady, intact, unbothered. As I drove home, the city unfolded the way it always did. Storefront lights blinked on. A bus hissed at a stoplight. Somewhere, a radio played too loudly in a car with the windows down. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The house came into view, quiet, unassuming, familiar. The porch light glowed softly, exactly where I'd left it. I parked, sat for a moment longer, hands resting on the steering wheel, and let the silence catch up to me. That was when it settled. True power doesn't shout. It doesn't announce itself or demand recognition. It doesn't need witnesses or applause. It doesn't rush to correct people when they're wrong about you. True power sits quietly in a gray cardigan. It eats its dessert without asking for permission. It listens more than it speaks. It understands that most judgments are based on costume, not character. And it lets people wear their assumptions until they become uncomfortable. Power like that doesn't interrupt. It waits. It lets others reveal themselves first. Inside that restaurant, nothing I said had changed the room. Not until the room chose to change on its own. Not until the truth arrived in a form no one could argue with, or talk around, or politely dismiss. And even then, I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't corrected anyone. I hadn't needed to. I thought of my son, sitting at that table, finally seeing me without the filter of someone else's expectations. I thought of the look on his face, not shock, but understanding. The kind that arrives late but stays longer. I hoped he remembered that part. Not the title, not the recognition, but the restraint. Because restraint is what lasts when noise fades. When I stepped inside my house, the quiet welcomed me back. Familiar floors. Familiar walls. A space that didn't need to impress anyone. I set my keys down, slipped off my shoes, and moved through the rooms the way I always had. Unhurried, unobserved, unjudged. That too was power. The kind you carry without showing. The kind that doesn't need to prove itself twice. True power doesn't shout. It sits quietly. It finishes its dessert. And it lets the world figure it out, when it's already too late to pretend nothing has changed.